as Greg mentioned, I'm the Montana State Extension Forestry Specialist. So I work with the county agents. I'm also a forest ecology and management professor at the University of Montana College of Forestry and Conservation, though I'm employed through Montana State University, which confuses a lot of people and makes life quite interesting. My predecessor always thought it was a real bad deal to be faculty at one university, housed at another. I think it's great because my boss is in Bozeman, and my faculty peers are in Missoula. And if you know anything about faculty bodies, if you have 10 faculty, you usually have 20 opinions. And so I can pretty much say what I want to, and there's no repercussions because my boss is in Bozeman. So it's a pretty good deal. It's always fascinating for me to come to the Black Hills region because as a forest ecologist, I grew up in Wisconsin and went to school at Michigan State and then out in Idaho. The Black Hills is this real interesting combination of a little bit of Midwestern forest ecology and a little bit of Montana further west forest ecology. And just the other day I had a chance to drive around the northern Black Hills a little bit and saw some of the vegetation types of ponderosa pine overstory with the birch understory, which for Montana is insane. If that were in Montana, it would be a grand fir forest because of the moisture gradients that are there. So it's very interesting, and as we talk and hear more about climate variability and climate change and how things might change in Montana, we're trying to vision what our new forest ecosystems might develop into. And certainly for me, the Black Hills gives a little bit of insight of some of the plant combinations that we may see develop in Montana that right now we would just say, no, that's just not possible. And the same thing with some of your oak woodlands out there as well. It's quite fascinating for me to see that, having spent the last 30 years in Montana and Idaho and gaining a lot of familiarity with those forest ecosystems. But as mentioned, in Montana, we kind of have a slightly unique forest stewardship program in that we have the State Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, which has service foresters that go and help private forest landowners, and then we have the Extension program. And when the stewardship funding first came available to help private forest landowners get a handle on exploring and gaining more information about their forests and ultimately developing a forest management plan, it was decided that in Montana, we're going to do it largely as an educational program where we take landowners through a curriculum and they write their own plans. And then the service forestry component of it would be the tail end of it. So our workshop right now started out as a 5-day workshop, which is a huge time demand. We've got it down to a 3-day workshop where landowners come into a classroom setting for 2 days. We give them the basics of forest ecology and inventorying. We teach them how to use some core inventory techniques. And then they go home for a week with a cruiser's vest full of equipment and some stand analysis guides. They put in some transects on their property, and they inventory their own property, and then they come back for a final day and put together their own management plan. And I'm going to walk you through a little bit of that today. There's really 2 parts to this program. One is a little bit of an overview of our stewardship program, and then we'll have a break and time for questions and discussion. And then I have a little bit of a program for you that I call the 5 most important things you need to know about forest management. And we're also going to try and do this in cooperation with electronics, which may or may not cooperate with us. Anyways, so the other part you should know about our stewardship program in Montana is, since I've been involved with it from the get-go, then once the landowners have kind of put together their own management plan, we have a trained professional. This is a professional who works either for the state or industry or as a consultant or even Forest Service. We put them through a training program so that they can better relate to landowners and leave some of their professional arrogance and jargon at home. And they go out and then they do a walkthrough, spend a day to half a day with a landowner and their stewardship plan, do a walkthrough to answer questions, to verify that what the landowners have inventoried makes sense, because people get confused sometimes between a grand fir and a Doug fir and things like that. So we want to make sure they got their species right and that their ages and that they're reading things correctly. And that then is the basis of a certified stewardship plan. Now in the past, when we first started this, that was the end, okay? You did that out of personal gratification, and you learned more about your property, and most landowners were very happy because they saw parts or looked at their forest a little differently than they had before. What we've done in the meantime is we've merged that together with the tree farm program, that if you certify your stewardship plan, you can automatically sign up for the tree farm program. And if you're not familiar with that, I'll be talking a little bit more about that. That's a nationally recognized program. It's a sustainable forestry certification regime that still is cost-free to landowners versus other regimes that are out there. And we took the next step in that we formed a partnership with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The most consistent cost share money available to landowners is through the EQIP program through NRCS. And in the past, to qualify that, and still now, applying for federal cost share is probably like doing your taxes 5 times. It is an arduous process. But nonetheless, now you get a shortcut because with a stewardship or tree farm plan, that automatically qualifies for a conservation plan with NRCS, which is the first step required by landowners to apply for cost share with NRCS. So this mutual recognition, the idea is to make it more seamless and easier for you to, 1, learn about your forest, 2, write a management plan, 3, implement action items that you might decide that you want to do, and if it's something that's deemed beneficial to society as a whole, water quality or wildlife habitat or fire hazard reduction, then you can much more easily apply for cost share money that will help you accomplish those things that normally you would have to pay out of your pocket. So that's kind of the system we have going in Montana. So far it's worked pretty well. It takes a lot of work to keep it running because when you're collaborating amongst multiple entities and agencies, you're also dealing with multiple personalities, multiple people that are in charge of things, and it's always hard for people to give up their I'm in charge of this and say, okay, I'll let someone else do it. So it requires work, and what it really requires is the real benefit is the more landowners that ran through this program. They also tend to join the Montana Forest Owners Association that works together with Tree Farm a lot, and this is a landowner representative group. So these folks, every legislative session will go to Helena and have agendas for our legislature. When the state wants to impose new regulations on things like fees or taxes, etc., they first have to go basically to the Montana Forest Owners Association and Tree Farm and get their endorsement, because if they don't, these folks will go to the legislature and raise holy heck about it. And so they are a force, the landowners in Montana through this program are a force to be reckoned with for their landowner rights. And in my perspective, that's as it should be. So on to the topic of forest management planning. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have a forest management plan on your property? Okay, quite a few of you, okay. So some of this is going to be a little redundant and maybe give you a little bit different perspective. Now, interestingly enough, American Forest Foundation or National Tree Farm has adopted the plan that we created in Montana as the national plan. Now, that may change, but right now that's what they're using as their national forest management plan template. But first off, why did this all come about, and why go through all this trouble? Forests have existed for a long time. So I throw this up here just to put things into perspective, because in Montana, as the 4th largest state in the union, and what you're seeing there is airline traffic in 24 hours in the world. That's just 24 hours of air flights. In Montana, we're the 4th largest state, but we have less than 1 million inhabitants. And as I tell folks there, we live in an aberrant world. We have lots of space. And so a lot of forest landowners in Montana go, well, why do this? I mean, we're fine. And, there's no financial advantage for us to do this. I mean, we've tried to create one through this collaboration. But why do this? Well, the rest of the world is a very, very crowded place. 98% of the world's population lives in an urban or suburban type of environment. Their experience with forests and wildlife and things like that is what they see on the Discovery Channel. And most people I talk to, even back where I grew up in Wisconsin and Michigan, their dream was to make it out to Glacier National Park one year and maybe see a grizzly bear. And so their perception of forests in Montana is it's the last best place where there's bears and elk and deer and all this, you can escape from it all, and wilderness and all these other wonderful things. And for Montana landowners, just like I'm pretty sure Black Hills landowners, you don't have to deal with that as much. You live in where you want to be, hopefully. So this is just a little bit of an overview where all this stuff came from. And I'm just going to throw up some old data, and I'm going to run through this first part pretty quick because it's a lot of forms and statistics and numbers and things like that that can get a little tedious to look at. But periodically, the USDA, Forest Service, states kind of want to know what's going on. What's the state of the land out there? They do this with agriculture. They do this with forests. It's a national inventory. And here's some data that got put together in 2002. It's already out of date. But when we look at the U.S., basically 1/3 of the nation's landscape is forested, and 57% of these forests are privately owned. Now, industry used to own a lot, but they've divested of it for tax purposes. So really the majority of forests across the U.S. are owned by private forest landowners. And so on this picture, the green is private forest owners, the yellow is state or federal ownership, and the rest is non-forested. And so you see the Black Hills out there in South Dakota. Montana, 67% of the forest is federally owned, only 19%, well, let me back up here a second. Yeah, correct, 19% is owned by private forest landowners. We still have a viable wood products industry. Private ownership nowadays provides about 60% of the forest harvested for the wood products industry. Very little coming off the federal lands. In the Black Hills, you're still blessed that you have a Forest Service that's able to do things and isn't constantly being challenged by advocacy groups on things. So that 18% of private ownership in Montana is critical for maintaining our forest products infrastructure. And flip side, the forest products infrastructure is critical for private landowners because if they want to do fire hazard reduction or beetle reduction or things like that, their first way is if they have merchantable timber, then they can afford through the income of that timber to do something on their property. And for some of the larger forest landowners, we have some ranches, timber is a viable source of income for them. So, on a national scale, of course, as you get to the eastern United States, it's almost all privately owned. But when we look at forest ownership trends, basically what's been happening is forest, and this only goes till 2002, but forest industry lands has actually really declined because they have divested of their forested lands. Non-industrial private is staying sort of the same, but there are some real changes going on in there. Particularly in the size of those types of holdings. The majority of the landowners are in the 1 to 9 acre category, or basically, if you go up to 50 acres, that's going to be almost 80% of forest landowners in Montana own relatively small parcels, where a vast minority owns the larger parcels that are out there. There has been a changing trend where larger parcels are being broken up into smaller parcels. It's actually much more dramatic if you look at more recent data on this. So the 1 to 9 acre and the 10 to 50 acre holdings have been gaining a lot, and the larger acreage holdings have been becoming less and less. So, but when you look at the area, total area involved, you can see that the land base in the 1 to 50 acre range is pretty small, and the majority of land is still owned by very large landowners. Now, these trends of smaller parcels has a lot of people concerned for the same reason that would occur if you have a 1,000-acre farm that breaks into 110-acre parcels. You lose a certain amount of productivity off of that land that provides essential food and wood and raw materials for our economy to function for people to live off of. And the humorous thing that's always thrown out there by the wood products industry is, if you really think the wood products industry is evil, try using a corn cob instead of toilet paper. And they're often tongue-in-cheek, people said, well, the forest products industry should just boycott producing toilet paper for a month and see how people come around to thinking how important this is. And was it not too recently in the news, what was it, was it Costa Rica or Nicaragua ran out of toilet paper, and they had an emergency import from the United States of 1 billion rolls of toilet paper. And so, I mean, it's somewhat humorous to think about, but our suburban and urban society these days, of course, believes that wood and groceries and all those things come from the store, and they don't necessarily connect that with land ownership. So private ownership, this is a general federal statement that landowners with less than 10 acres are likely not managing under a forest management plan. Landowners with more than 500 acres typically are, because it's enough of a land base where it's an economic resource and it may pay to hire a consultant, etc. So the 10 to 500 acre group consists of about 4 million people nationwide, so it is a significant number. When we look at overall ownership objectives of what people want, home sites, aesthetics, legacy, investments, recreation, you see timber is way down on the list, and particularly down on the list for the smaller acreage landowners. And of course that makes perfect sense. If you own 10 acres, realistically, how much timber are you going to get off of that land? Now, I own 20 acres. I manage it as a tree farm, and I'll give you a little bit of example of that later on. I expect to harvest a load of logs off of it about every 10 years. I just this winter cut a load, just sold it to a mill. I will net probably around between $600 and $800 off of that. Okay, it's not something that we can buy a new car with, but my wife's pretty excited for that check to be coming in. So it's nothing to sneeze at either. So, people harvest timber for different reasons. Trees will mature, stand improvement. These days, insect, disease, and wildfire are primary reasons, particularly for smaller acreage landowners, to be doing some kind of harvesting activity. Price historically was a pretty sensitive thing. Our economy has been in the tank for the last 5 years, and the wood products industry has been no different. So timber has not been worth all that much, but nonetheless, there are multiple reasons to be harvesting. So there's other forest activities that of course are important. You as landowners know that, so I don't need to spend a lot of time. So to the point, forest certification, what does that mean? Who's doing it? Well, Tree Farm kind of claims fame to being the first certification program actually in the world, and that was started by Weyerhaeuser Company in 1941. And basically, if you go back in history and think on those times, turn of the century and then after World War II, there was a massive housing shortage. And to provide lumber for those houses, timber was cut pretty heavily. And in my native home state of Wisconsin, of course, it used to be vast forests of giant white pines. There's not a lot of that left anymore. I mean, partly because of introduced diseases, but pretty much Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox mythology was in the Midwest harvesting the white pine. And when that was liquidated, they moved west, and private lands got hit pretty hard. And the timber companies, the timber barons saw that private lands were a valuable asset for their timber resource. So they started a program to help landowners reforest, basically, and manage their forests for timber production. Now, since that time, some other things have happened. The Forest Stewardship Council really emerged about 1995, and that was based on global concerns about tropical forest harvesting and things like that. And we've had all sorts of other things emerge over time too, and I'll a little bit more on that as we go through here. Really what's driven it in the past, some but not all environmental groups, some used radical tactics, but basically it's when they're, starting with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the environmental awareness that occurred, and concerns with industrial logging where whole mountainsides were being harvested, and people were seeing what was formerly dense timber turn into clear cuts. And without delving any further into that, got concerned about it. And there were reasons for it. I mean, there was some serious erosion issues, stream water quality degradation that came with it. As the United States was booming, housing shortages, we needed lumber, it needed to come off the mountains pretty quick. So there were some really credible concerns that started, and of course we had some real strong groups start these movements already when I was in school, which was longer ago than I care to admit. But the strategy that they followed was two-pronged. One is to stop logging on forest lands by going out there and spiking trees and climbing trees and burying yourself up to your neck in the road, of the logging road, and things like that. That didn't work so well because it put people out of work, and it didn't, if the cameras didn't show up, who cares? So the other strategy they followed was to go with the retailers, where they started targeting Home Depot, Time Warner, the biggest paper consumer in the world, doing these publicity stunts where they were basically advertising that these companies were supporting the destruction of rainforests and forests by just buying wood fiber wherever they got it the cheapest. Kind of analogous to child labor, producing jeans and things like that. And they were very effective. The big companies started to worry about their image because a 2% drop in sales was a huge change in their profit margin. And so they started to listen to this, and World Wildlife Fund, Save Tropical Forests, these types of things started to have a pretty big amount of clout on what was happening out there. And so we had Time Warner, other major brands, Home Depot, Nike, Kinko's, even Starbucks, McDonald's, what kind of containers is your burger wrapped in? And basically they all signed on saying, hey, we won't buy materials unless it's been certified that it's coming from sustainably managed landscapes. Okay? And this is huge. In Europe, you cannot sell wood unless it's certified. Europeans will not buy American wood unless it's certified, sustainable. Okay? Federal government building, the LEED system. Who's heard of the LEED building system? Okay, it's a green building system. To date, they will not buy lumber unless it comes from FSC certified sustainable certification regime. And SFI, as a landowner, is very expensive. Someone's going to have to come on your property every year, certify that you're not using the wrong pesticides, that you're not over-harvesting, that you're not degrading wildlife habitat, that you're not doing all these things, and they'll charge you $100 an acre to do that, and then you can sell your wood to someone who's building with the LEED system, okay? Well, for landowners and for industry, that would basically kill them. You can't deal with that kind of additional cost in a world market, particularly one where you compete against China and other places that may not be involved with this. So along came Tree Farm, which has been around for a long time, and here's just some of the history. There were international summits. I mean, you've all heard about the Kyoto Protocols. The first summit was in Rio de Janeiro, and then we had the Montreal process, where international community of academics and scientists sat down and said, okay, what's important? If someone's managing a forest, what's important that they need to address on there? And by not buying their wood, we're going to enforce that they have to address these concerns in order for them to sell their wood to us. So we're going to basically create a captive market there. And so these are some of the regimes that came out of this. Now, Tree Farm system has been around for a long time, and it was there as a voluntary system by the wood products industry to help private forest landowners. It wasn't a certification regime. It wasn't saying, hey, if you're not Tree Farm, we won't buy your logs or your lumber. It was a voluntary process to help landowners. Well, this became a natural solution. We already had this in place that, hey, let's just do, up the standards, say, here's your management plan, and we're going to have a checkoff list. Here are things that you're considering in your management plan that are required by these international standards. You're ready to have a tree farm management plan in place. We'll add these little protocols on there, and now you have a free certification system. And we'll tie that with what industry came up, which was called the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. They recognized the tree farm program. So now major paper mills, sawmills, etc., that both go through an internal auditing system to show that, hey, here's where we get our wood from, and we treat it this way, and we're not using dangerous substances and all this type of thing, and we're buying our wood from landowners that are in the tree farm program. This is now internationally recognized by Europe and everybody else that if you're under the tree farm label, which isn't that hard to do, that your wood is being managed sustainably. It's a little extra work for you to go through the paperwork, but then it's done. But the other wonderful things that have come out of this, like we've done in Montana, is the tree farm program. Now that we have 500 tree farm members in Montana. That's not a lot. I mean, we've got 28,000 landowners who own 10 acres or more of forested land. Of that, we've got 500 tree farm members. But that 500 tree farm members represent the forest landowners in Montana. And they represent those forest landowners to the legislature, to the United States government, to international groups, all through the tree farm system. And it costs them nothing, okay? Many of them will donate some money because naturally operating an organization like this costs a little bit of money. But we send a delegation to Washington, D.C. every other year. They're always involved with our Montana legislature. So there's more to it than just learning about your forest and doing the paperwork and being certified. Now, perhaps in the future, and in certain places, if you're certified, your logs will bring a better market. People will pay you to get certified wood. Right now in Montana, that doesn't happen. But what does happen, if you're a tree farm member, you get newsletters, you're invited to field tours, to educational events, and the biggest benefit to landowners is that the organization is an advocate for landowner rights, property landowner rights. Okay, we get a tax break down to 20 acres if you're managing your forest. Okay, and the difference is tract land tax is going to be about $200 an acre, depending which county you're in and which city donut you're in. Forest land taxes is going to vary based on productivity, but averages around $5 to $6 an acre. So it really is worthwhile, but you have to show that you're actually managing your forest and you're producing not only wood, but wildlife habitat, water quality, all of those types of things. So you know, this is kind of what this is all about. The American tree farm system, these are tree farmers based on density in the United States. You can see that Wisconsin and Minnesota, the southeast are pretty strong. You got some here in the Black Hills. Montana, you can see where we are there. It's mainly the Mountain Valley bottoms where we have tree farm members. Oregon, Washington are really big states. They're pretty urban states these days, and tree farm has been instrumental there in keeping landowner rights in check and allowing them to maintain their property and manage them as forests. When there's tremendous pressures from the urban populations to saying, well, heck, you know, I'm paying X taxes on my 1/10 of an acre city lot. This fellow owns 100 acres. They ought to be paying their fair share in taxes. But they don't realize that, you know, owning that land has other costs and responsibilities. And hey, if they got to pay that much on their property, they probably won't be able to maintain it. So just as an overview, Tree Farm is part of an American Forest Foundation program. American Forest Foundation is a 501c3, non-for-profit. They also do Project Learning Tree. They have a habitat conservation program. And as I said, this remains a cost-free program for forest managers, tree farm members in the United States. Now, onto this management plan template. Gave you a little handout that says something to the effect of rationale behind the forest management plan template. Okay, my background is variable, but I've been heavily involved with forest management. I've been heavily involved in forest ecology, forest health type issues and research. And so when I got to dealing with this, where every entity was doing its own thing, NRCS was doing their thing, state was doing their thing, extension was doing their thing, and it was all based on some committee that got together and figured out what was supposed to be important, I kind of thought, well, this is nuts. You know, everybody has their own little thing here. So as an ecologist and a manager, I sat down just in an evening and wrote down a list of things that I thought was important, that a landowner ought to be at least thinking about when they're thinking about doing something on their property. Harvesting trees is one of those. But say fire hazard reduction, that's another thing. It has a huge impact. And so I made an ecological checklist. And then I went back and I tried to temper that into the reality of management, okay? Because there's the ideal world of things you would like to do, and then there's the real world of things you can do. And some of those can-dos are based on the technology of logging or harvesting. You know, you may have a dense clump of trees and say, okay, I just want to remove the little itty-bitty suppressed trees that are in the middle of this dense clump. Well, get your saw and try and remove those. It's pretty hard because they're stood up by all the other trees, and if you get a logger out there with mechanized equipment, he's going to look at it and say, how am I supposed to get in there and get those trees? This is where the ideal meets the reality, saying, okay, so I have to have some way of pulling these trees out of this dense thing. The same thing is with crossing steep ground or crossing a stream. Most states now have laws regulating water quality, and you cannot run a dozer through a creek because all that muck that gets churned up goes downstream and messes with somebody. So what this management template is, and you have a copy of it. Well, anyways, I put this together. I ran this by industry. I ran this by consultants. This is probably version 10. And we finally fine-tuned it down to something that, consider it a tool, an awareness tool. There are many forms, or many blanks on here, okay? And like I said, it's kind of analogous to doing your taxes. But don't think you have to fill out every blank that's in here. This is a checklist. So these are things you ought to be aware about. You know, the first page is basically, okay, if I'm a forester and I'm going to come out and help you, how the heck do I find you? Where are you? Okay? All of us that work with folks or have gotten directions from folks have sooner or later gotten the directions of, well, you go 5 miles down this road and you turn left where the old Conoco used to be. All right, well, that's not getting me there. So that's, you know, really we need to figure out how to get to your place. The other parts on here, and I've just pasted them up on here. You have them in front of you. So there's property ownership, but number one, if I'm with all my academic training and experiential knowledge and all that stuff, I come out on your property because you've asked me, hey, can you look at my forest and tell me what you think? Tell me what's going on here. Look at it with your trained eyes and give me some pointers or increase my awareness of what's going on here. The first thing I want to know is, why do you own your property? Because a forested property can be managed a million different ways. It all depends on what you want from it. You have landowners that buy 10 acres of forest liquidated and turn it into a pasture. Well, that's fine. If they bought the property, that's their right to do that, and they wanted grass for their livestock. All right? That's fine if that's your objective for your land. We have other landowners that want to create lynx habitat. Okay? So they're going to need certain things on that property, like lots of down woody debris and complex piles of wood that someone else or that someone who's dealing with fire suppression will look at and go, oh my God, you have the worst fire hazard here I've ever seen in my life. So what are your objectives? Why did you buy your property? And sometimes, what's the history of your property? It might have been an old homestead. My own property was logged in 1918. There's an old narrow gauge railroad that goes through it. Before that, it was part of an important cultural area for the Salish and Kootenai Indians. And so these are all things that make my property really special. I find stuff on my property going, wow, that's really cool. I've got a 5-foot diameter stump in my backyard that was a big old ponderosa pine that used to be there. You know, so I protect that stump. Oh, to me, that's what makes it unique. So as we go through this, and I don't want to talk too long on this real quick. So we go through this list. The second most important thing is to get an aerial photo or a topo map of your property. This is my 20 acres. This is Google Earth. I downloaded it, put it onto PowerPoint, and I drew all my lines. I have, and it really surprises some people, on my 20 acres, I have 9 management units on my property because I have 9 areas where I'm doing different things out there. I've got horses, so I want some pasture. That's number 2. I've got some really dog-hair dense stuff. That's number 5. Is that number 6? I'm sorry. I've got a couple does that have twin fawns in there every year. I got a cougar that hangs out in there and tries to eat the fawns. I've got a pond up over on the right side. I've got a moose that comes in there every year. I've got worries about fire hazard reduction. So number one, I've got a donut around my house. My objectives are different, and I can pencil that in with an aerial photo, and an aerial photo also lets me look and see where there are unique differences. And wherever there's uniformity, trees are all alike, I might want to treat that a little differently than we're at a different spot where the trees are alike. So this is number 2 on the plan, okay? Aerial photo, and then you can put Mylar over it, or you can get on a computer, and you make a overview. Hey, here's my property, here's what I want to do, here's my fire hazard reduction. When we had the Black Cat fire barreling down on us, I took my plan. I said, you know, back here number 7, I've done fuel hazard reduction, and they put in a fire line there. I've got a pond. They started dipping 3 helicopters out of it. And I just showed them where things were, and boom, they were ready to go with it. All right, so all this other stuff you can go through. These are checklists, things that are important. How flat is your property? How steep is it? What's your access like? What else do I have on here? Almost impossible. Your management units. What's unique about your management units? You can put 2 lines. My management unit number 5. I'm managing for Doug fir, ponderosa pine, and openings. Okay, so, and then once you've figured out what you have, then what do you want? Okay, just because your forest looks the way it does doesn't mean it has to stay that way. Forests are dynamic, they're changing. So here's what I have. What do I really want? And then how do I get there? That's where the management part of it comes into. So, you know, I have this diagram aerial photo. What do you want your tree distribution to look like? What do you want your overstory, understory to look like? Okay, and once you identify that, all you got to do is circle it. That's what I want it to look like. Then you can work with a professional and say, how do I get from point A to point B? Okay, so consider this template as a learning tool. It's an awareness tool. Okay, when I bought my first car, I didn't know what I all had to do on it. I got a checklist. Oh, I got to change the oil every 3,000 miles. I got to change the air filter every 15,000 miles. I got to change my tires at this point in time. That's all this is. This is a tool to look at what do I need to, what should I be thinking about? Okay, if I don't have a stream on my property, I just put in NA in riparian areas. Now, the other thing on here, all these checklist items, these are all items that have been identified internationally as things someone ought to think about when they're managing their forest. Okay, so this just isn't my dreamt up insanity here. This is stuff that's come out of the Montreal process, worldwide, etc. Because really the first thing you need to look at is the ecological potentials and constraints of your property, and that's what these are. Then there's cultural questions, okay? Because if there's a history on your property, you own your property for a certain point in time. Unfortunately, we don't persist forever, and sooner or later someone else is going to own that property. And so there's a legacy on there, and if there's an old homestead on your place, the next owner might think that's pretty cool. But on the other hand, if you don't care about it and you doze it under, then future generations won't have that opportunity to do that. I've got that big old stump. For me, I want that to persist. I protect that. I put preservative on it because, you know, this is a legacy. This is a history of cool, you know. So these are just things. That doesn't mean you have to do them, things to consider. Okay. Finally, you want to have a record of what you do. For tax purposes, you'd be amazed what you can write off and deduct when you know, that $800 I'm going to make, I have to declare that as income. But I can deduct against it all my expenses. The gasoline I used on my chainsaw, the number of new chains I needed for my chainsaw, part of the time I used my tractor, all those types of things. So ultimately, I will not be paying income tax on that $800 because I've got 10 years of work and investment against that I can deduct off of it. But you need to have these records to do that. And finally, what's called inspections, consider it a consultation. You're getting a professional out on your property to talk to you. Okay? That's what's really a really additionally important part of all of this, is getting someone out there. Doesn't mean you got to listen to them. Everybody has their biases, everybody has their opinions, and you have a more robust idea of what's going on the more opinions you listen to. And so keeping your foresters, your state foresters, your industry foresters, your consultants, having someone that you can bounce some ideas off of. I mean, talk about mountain pine beetle. There's a lot of different opinions out there of how to deal with mountain pine beetle. Okay, which one is the right one? Well, Only you can determine that for your property, and it's going to be based on who you listen to and the different inputs you get into that. So with that, I waited till Greg left, or is he in here somewhere? Oh, there you are. Okay, so Greg is your local contact here, okay, to help you with cost share, to help you with management plans and all this type of stuff. You can download this template. You can download everything we do in Montana from www.mttreefarm.org. I think it's on that somewhere. Right up on top here, on the end. www.mttreefarm.org. On the cover page, top right-hand corner. Okay, you can download this template. We've got other stuff on there. There are other states that produce really cool stuff. So, and that's part of the reason for me coming here is just to cross-disseminate. I was really curious how things operate down here in the Black Hills, and I'm getting some ideas on things, and so we're just sharing information.